On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the annual IMF and World Bank meeting has convened in Bali. Can the leaders of global free trade rein in Trump's protectionist impulses? And in tonight's Writing China, we meet the former bureau chief of CNN Beijing, Jaime Fleur-Cruz. He shares how he covered China's mosaic of stories through an impartial lens over 40 years.
But one thing was in common. They all wanted to change China and change their own lives.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. We begin today's show with this year's meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank in Bali. The leaders of several major international financial organizations said countries need to work together to settle the world's current trade disputes. The IMF has already cut its forecast for global growth for this year and next to 3.7%. It said the lower forecast reflected the China-US trade war and how emerging markets are struggling with tighter liquidity and capital flows. Before we go to our panel, take a look at this first.
Trade hostilities are taking their toll on global growth, and the IMF has the numbers to back that up. The World Economic Outlook dropped its global growth forecast from 3.9% for the years 2018 and 2019 down to 3.7%.
You know, we have always said at the IMF that trade war, trade tariffs are not helpful globally and are likely to have negative consequences on growth. So we maintain that view.
The IMF said the downgrade reflects a confluence of factors, including the ongoing China-US trade war, weak economic performance in the Eurozone, Britain, and Japan. In addition, rising interest rates are pressuring some emerging markets, notably Argentina, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, and Indonesia.
Whenever the dollar gets stronger and U.S. interest rates rise, financial conditions tighten for emerging markets. And this is something that happens every once in a while, and it's therefore important for emerging markets to have strong policy frameworks which can help them deal with these pressures. One line of defense is a very flexible exchange rate, which can help buffer shocks.
The organization also revised China's outlook for next year, forecasting only 6.2% growth in 2019 against its earlier 6.4% prediction. However, the IMF did stick to its projection for China for this year, that of 6.6% growth. The U.S. economy has maintained a relatively stable growth rate thanks to stimulus through radical fiscal policies. But the IMF said the effect will wear off by 2020.
What the WTO would consider the limits of how serious the tariffs can be, then we'd see a clear slowdown in the economy, and the impact on developing countries would be greater.
The IMF asserted that if Beijing and Washington were to resolve their trade differences, it would be a significant upside to the forecast.
For more on the IMF World Bank annual meeting, joining us in Beijing, we have Zhang Gong, who is a professor from the University of International Business and Economics. Also in Beijing, Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. Welcome to both of you. In London, in the UK, we are joined by Ian Begg, professor at the European Institute and also co-director of the Darendorf Forum of London School of Economics and Political Science. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. What do you make of the call made at the ongoing World Bank and IMF summit regarding de-escalating the trade tensions? Is it possible?
It risks falling on deaf ears because the principal protagonists on this are making up their own minds, and you can imagine who I'm talking about above all, and that is Donald Trump. He has his own view on where trade policy should go. He's coming up to his midterm elections, so he wants to be even more strident than normal. And that suggests to me that for all that the IMF and the World Bank and all the assembled ministers and prime ministers are going to be pushing in a different direction, they're not going to pay much attention in Washington.
The IMF, as a result, has already lowered the expectation about the growth in both the economies of China and the United States, and likely has a rippling effect to the rest of the world. Mr. Tangen, it seems it is quite a warning.
Yes, it is, but if you start looking at the assumptions of their report, that it's going to be $67 oil, that the interest rates are going to remain fairly stable, that currency is going to remain stable, this is not being borne out right now, and there could be even more harsh news. Across the board in ASEAN countries, they're looking to lose 15 to 20% of their growth. All right, China is only going to lose a very, very small part, maybe 0.3%. But the rest of these countries are really going to be hit hard.
It is the confidence that we are talking about here. That is really the most important, what the market is feeling. And as a result, how is it going to be translated into the business plans and also the purchasing powers? Professor Gong.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the economy has a lot to do with expectations. And keep in mind that we're actually into this boom cycle for quite a few years now. We have already passed the peak, as the report claims. I totally agree with that. And we're probably getting very close to the end of this booming cycle. So I think that's something of serious concern to a lot of countries, especially countries that have a foreign exchange problem because of the rising interest rate in the United States, the appreciation of the dollar. And on top of this, we have this trade tensions. So I think it's becoming more like a storm, perfect storm forming right now, and I think what is coming out of IMF and the World Bank is a very stern warning.
Developing countries, their currencies have been depreciating. Well, we see quite some movements going on in the United States with the U.S. dollar. Of course, we all understand that the U.S. dollar is still the currency, and therefore the bargaining power coming from the U.S. economy is tremendous against the other economies, particularly at a dramatic time. So, Professor Begg, what does all of that mean mixed up with the unpredictability in the market?
Well, what it means is a number of things. On the one hand, U.S. exports, as the dollar rises, will become more expensive, and this may to some extent mean that the effect of additional tariffs is mitigated, because in the exporting countries which now have lower exchange rates, they gain a competitive advantage. What it also means is some trouble for some of the countries which are heavy importers of commodities priced in dollars, and your guest just mentioned the rise in the price of oil, which tends to be priced in dollars, which magnifies the negative effect in other countries. So we're in a period in which we can see different forms of risks to international stability. But I would be very hesitant to say this is heading towards a full-blown recession. It's more a moderate downturn in prospect than the sort of crisis we saw 10 years ago.
Professor Gong, you agree with that?
I think we still have to give it some more time to see if it is going to be a minor pullback or if it's going to be a recession. I'm not sure. I think we're still too early to make a call like that. But I do think that if we keep down this path of prolonged trade tensions, if the tariffs are going to stay there, and especially that Donald Trump is going to increase the tariff to 25% beginning the end of this year, it's going to be a pretty ugly picture. I'm a little bit concerned.
It is already quite an ugly picture to begin with, by the way. Mr. Tangen.
I'm completely on the other side of that. I mean, global investment is down, debt is up, stocks are overvalued. We are seeing all the classic warning signs. If you start looking at the graphs, it's all there. Moody's Financial has already forecasted that there will be a recession in 2020. It's coming. Everybody's knowing that. Even the Fed is preparing for this. Everyone thinks that they're doing this because of inflation and things like that. No, they're doing this so that they have something in the war chest when the recession comes. Right now, they wouldn't have anything.
You know also very well that even though all the signs of the so-called storm is there, does not mean the storm is coming immediately. That could always be a delay in time. There are many factors that come into play.
Yes, if I knew when, I would be very rich.
That's a more than $1 trillion question. Absolutely.
It is coming.
Absolutely. And we hope it is not coming that soon. But realities are thinking otherwise, it seems. But Professor Begg, let me ask you further. Given the quite political speech given by the Vice President of the United States regarding how the U.S. current administration is looking at China, namely already a competitor, a rival, the priority of future containment, it seems that the two largest of the world's economies are pretty much on a rocky road for years to come. So this is not just about the trade war anymore. Are we worrying about some kinds of signs leading us to similar situations during the Cold War? Or this is totally a different stage? What I just asked is really out of the question.
I think we can classify it as being downside risks in all respects. International political stability, international economic stability, all subject to downside risks. But the reaction of the Chinese leadership, I think, has been very sensible in this. They seem to have hesitated to provoke things still further. Clearly Mike Pence's speech has been provocative, but China seems to me to be adopting a wait-and-see approach rather than jumping in with countermeasures that are excessive. And I think that's very sensible because, as I mentioned before, a lot of the posturing going on in the US is about the forthcoming midterm elections, and they will be out of the way next month. So let's revisit this when we have more idea of whether it's just posturing or whether it's a more fundamental realignment that's going on. And in this regard, the conclusion of what you might call NAFTA 2, even though they don't call it that, may be a more positive sign.
Mr. Tangen.
Well, I think it's been a pretty much full-blown offensive, and if you look at the latest one and this leaked administrations to the Financial Times saying that they expect Xi to send a list of concessions prior to a sideline meeting that's coming up, that's incredible. I mean, this is the worst nightmare scenario you can imagine. The U.S. and China have stopped talking. They're canceling their military-to-military talks. Right. They're canceling their trade talks. I don't know how you can read this any other way. Yes, there is a midterm election, but it's not going to change Donald Trump. He's still going to be looking to collect scalps, you know, these kind of meaningless chorus and NAFTA things.
Right, but the thing is, Professor Gong, is not stopping at President Trump, but this is what some Washington insiders has already called a consensus reached by two parties regarding how they are likely to deal with China in the future. Of course, one party may express it in a much polite way, the establishment might express it in a much more diplomatic way, but still, expressing is one of it, doing is another. So, Professor Gong, with those in mind, shall we prepare for a winter?
I still have a little bit optimism still left. I think, you know, there actually, I mean, look at the Pence speech. He talks about a lot of things. He talks beyond the trade issues and it brings back a lot of these old acquisitions against China. In addition to this, he also makes a new acquisition this time. That is about China's attempt to interfere in the U.S. politics. I mean, we can debate about whether this is indeed interference, but at least, you know, there's something new here.
Whether are we seeing this as a warning sign that will lead us to much more political chaos, which certainly have a damping effect on the world economy. If you look at the Cold War back in the 1960s and the 70s, you have an idea about how it was like. But especially now, today's China is not yesterday's USSR. Right. China's economy is so much involved in everybody's economy, and so is the U.S. economy. So how should we understand the current situation? That is the big picture.
I was just about to say this. I think there are actually two schools of thoughts in Washington right now. One is the people around him still trying to make this sort of trade war lasting for many, many years to come. I mean, the purpose is
but what about your thought? That's what I want to ask. Not his thought, not Washington's thought, but your thought about all of these.
My thought is that Donald Trump is still interested in making a deal. I think what Pence's speech is part of a broad propaganda campaign to sort of add chips in its negotiation with China. There's actually an article leaked to the Axios website saying that Donald Trump is asking his people to start a campaign of propaganda. And I think
even our economist is already being dragged into the saga relating to whatever is true or not about what Trump is thinking or not thinking every day. So let me go to you, Professor Beck, about that too. This is not the only news. The other news is Brexit. I mean, you have a much closer feel about that than most of us. We see stories are cooking up about how the future might be like as a result of isolation, as a result of questioning the regionalization, the internationalization, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world too. Brexit is another story. So having said all of this, are we seeing really one after another warning sign? When the IMF and the World Bank having this meeting, what consensus can they really reach conveniently in a way in order to at least prevent some of the negative effect of all of these things happening?
Well, the first thing they can do is to continue to speak in favor of the liberal trading regime which has prevailed for now the best part of 80 years. They can also insist that countries recognize the potential damage through the forecasts that are being issued. Pointing out the facts in an era of fake news may not always work, but it's useful to try to connect with what citizens are thinking and to inform citizens that there are negative consequences of some of the things that are being done in their name. And you mentioned Brexit. I see it daily here. You can see just behind me that where they're all debating this.
Right.
Daily here, the concerns that things are going badly and a lack of certainty about where it's going to end up. Now, we can come back to this if you want to pursue the matter, but I think that the UK is possibly facing a constitutional crisis if things don't resolve themselves pretty quickly.
This is the time, many would argue, exactly about whether the international system that is existing today since the Second World War is going to work or not at a time of crisis. One could see also that argument from the other side of the story. Mr. Tengen.
Well, quite frankly, I mean, this is the problem with Donald Trump. He's taken a unilateral approach to the world and basically said, it's going to be my way or the highway. This is a stark contrast to what I think another administration would do, which would be to reassemble, use the existing trade mechanisms, WTO, to sit down and try to negotiate. Obviously, there are shared concerns with Europe and some other groups out there. It could be a negotiation that could be had. Donald Trump is just the bull in the china shop.
Right. There's IMF, World Bank. There's likely to be the APEC. There's later followed up by the G20. Of course, during this process, the midterm election already taking place in the United States. A lot of things going on when these heads of states, when some of the most important ministers and technocrats really meeting with one another. Is there at least some very basic consensus and tools they could reach out, Professor Gong?
Well, I think there's a global consensus that this cannot go on forever. I mean, we need to resolve this, and we need to persuade him to change course. But I don't think it's going to be very successful. He has his own agenda. He is going to be accountable to his own political base. So
what can the rest of us do?
Well, I guess we have to engage in these negotiations. We have to keep the talk still going on, and I think we should really think deeply about what we can do on our side that we can somehow alleviate his concerns. And some of these things actually are also in our own interests. For things like strengthening protection of IPR.
Right, the list go on. And let me ask you also, Professor Beck. After all, each economies in the world can do their part. Obviously, it is reluctant, but still they can do it. And yet, it is the most important thing that whether countries and economies can coordinate and cooperate. Professor?
Well, I think that there is plenty of scope with relationships between, on the one hand, China and other countries of East Asia and Europe to expand some of the things that they want to do in trade. Bilateral deals have become the new normal in trade relationships rather than the multilateral deals because, as we all know, the Doha round has been inextricably stalled for the last 5 years and making no progress whatsoever. So some impetus can come from these kinds of relationships. There are other emerging markets, notably in South America, where repair is needed. We know the problems that Argentina is going through. We know that there's a prospect of a more populist government in Brazil. These are things where the repeated enunciation of the benefits of free trade can still feed into the debates elsewhere in the world, even if Donald Trump isn't listening.
Mr. Tengen.
Well, you have the four horsemen of the apocalypse: Bannon, Miller, Lighthizer, and Navarro, who are counseling Trump that this is the time to strike, that if the U.S. is going to remodel the world in its image, that it must do so now. If it waits 5 years even, that China will prevent it. So these are the people he's listening to, and they believe that this is necessary to make American exceptionalism a reality, where the U.S. will lead the rest of the world into a liberal democratic capitalism with no exceptions.
Okay, with the ongoing World Bank IMF meeting.
80% of the world is not the U.S.
Exactly.
That's
what I exactly want to ask before we go, gentlemen. That is, if you want to openly say your expectation for this year's World Bank IMF meeting, I understand it's really a routine meeting, not much will really be achieved, but at least what kinds of consensus would you expect it to happen, or at least it should work on? Professor Begg, from you, very briefly.
Keep channels open, keep talking, keep insisting on the benefits of free trade, and you will have a very persuasive argument to put to the rest of the world.
Mr. Tengen.
This is not, they're not alone. The OECD has come out with exactly a similar report. It's very clear that we're heading towards a downturn, and Donald Trump is intent on pushing the world off a cliff.
Professor Gong.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump, what he's trying to do is to keep the Article 20 or 32.10 with the Europeans and Japan. And in fact, he's actually creating a WTO 2.0 version, and we should prevent that from happening.
All right, Professor Zhang Gong, Mr. Einar Tengen, Professor Ian Begg. Really appreciate the gentlemen for being with us. Thank you so much for your insights. Stay with us here on World Insights. Still to come.